I was standing in the middle of what used to be my quiet backfield, only now it looked like a page torn from a glossy real estate brochure. 40 brand new homes lined up in perfect rows, their manicured lawns still smelling of fresh sod. "You're trespassing on HOA property." Karen's voice cut through the warm afternoon air like a dull saw blade. She stood on the nearest porch, arms crossed, sunglasses flashing, with 2 board members nodding behind her like obedient bobbleheads. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even take a step forward. I just smiled, because I knew something she didn't, something that made every brick, every nail, and every square inch of those houses mine. I owned the dirt under her feet, the pavement she strutted on, even the driveway she was blocking me from. And the best part, she had no idea she'd built her little HOA empire on my land, until it was far too late. My name's Jack Morrison. I'm 56 years old, a retired civil engineer, and for most of my life, I've been the kind of man who minded his own business. I grew up with the smell of sawdust in my nose and dirt under my nails. My father was a carpenter, my mother a school teacher. They didn't leave me much in the way of money, but they did leave me something better: land. Nearly 30 acres on the edge of a lake, tucked away just enough to make you feel like the world's noise can't reach you. When I left my job and moved back here full-time, my plan was simple: fish in the mornings, work in the garden in the afternoons, and maybe tinker with old furniture in the shed when the mood struck. The land had been in my family for 3 generations, and I treated it with the same quiet respect my father did. There was a main house, a few weathered outbuildings, and long stretches of grass and trees rolling down toward the water. The far end of my property, the part that would later become the heart of the fight, was mostly just open field with some scrub pine. Life here had a rhythm. I'd wake up early, coffee in hand, and walk the perimeter while the fog still clung to the lake. You could hear loons calling in the distance and smell that clean, sharp mix of pine and water. My nearest neighbor on the east side was a widow named Elaine, who baked pies like it was a competitive sport. To the west, the road curved toward the main subdivision, the place where the HOA reigned. I never had much to do with them. The HOA kept their rules, and I kept my space. It was a good arrangement. That is, until the day Karen moved in. If you've never met a Karen, count yourself lucky. This one full name, Karen Whitfield, was something else. She had that way of speaking where every sentence sounded like a legal notice, the kind that makes you feel like you're already in trouble before you've done anything. She was always dressed like she was heading to a country club meeting, even when she was just walking her perfectly groomed poodle. And she never walked alone. There was always an entourage of HOA board members trailing behind her, clutching clipboards like they were shields. Our first meeting was telling. I was fixing a loose board on my fence when she walked up, introduced herself as the new president of the Lakeside HOA, and without even asking my name, launched into a spiel about shared community values and aligning properties with HOA standards. I smiled politely, told her my land wasn't part of the HOA, and went back to hammering. That was the end of the conversation, or so I thought. What I didn't know then was that Karen had a vision, and that vision involved my land. She saw the open field at the back of my property as wasted potential, a prime spot for Phase 3 of their Lakeside Villas project. From what I'd later hear through the grapevine, she'd been bragging about it at board meetings before she even spoke to me. But back then, I had no reason to suspect anything. I spent my days like always fixing the old dock, repainting the shutters, maybe driving into town to pick up supplies. I'd nod to the HOA folks when I saw them in the grocery store, and they'd give me that polite but distant smile people reserve for someone they think they'll never have to deal with. Looking back, there were small signs, surveyors showing up by mistake near my southern property line, flyers in my mailbox advertising future luxury homes with suspiciously familiar lake views. A couple of strangers even wandered onto my land one weekend, maps in hand, saying they were just checking out the lots. I'd laugh it off, point them toward the subdivision, and forget about it. Then there was the day I caught Karen herself standing at the edge of my field with 2 men in suits. They were gesturing at the land, taking notes, talking fast. When she saw me coming, she waved like we were old friends. Just discussing community improvements, she called out. I nodded, thinking maybe they were planning a walking trail or something harmless. It's funny how easy it is to trust the status quo, to believe that the ground under your feet will always be yours because it always has been. That's the thing about land, it doesn't move. But the lines on paper, the ones in some dusty file cabinet at the county office, those can shift if the wrong hands start pushing them. At the time, though, my focus was on the life I'd built. Evenings on the porch, watching the sunset turn the lake into molten gold. Weekly poker games with a couple of old friends from high school. A refrigerator full of leftovers from Elaine's pie experiments. Peace. If you'd told me then that my land would soon be crawling with bulldozers, that strangers would be pouring concrete on my grass, that a war, yes, a war was about to start between me and the HOA, I would have laughed. The kind of laugh you give when you hear about something absurd happening in another town to someone else. But the thing about trouble is, it doesn't knock. It just walks right in and makes itself at home. And in my case, it didn't just walk in, it brought an entire construction crew with it. Let us know where you're watching from today, and if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community. It was a Tuesday morning in late spring when I first realized something was off. I'd just poured my second cup of coffee and was heading out to check the fence line when I heard the low, steady rumble of heavy machinery. Not the distant hum you get from the highway on a windy day, but close, too close. I followed the sound toward the back of the property, boots crunching on the damp grass, until I reached the open field at the southern edge. That's when I saw them. Bright orange survey stakes dotted the ground like someone had planted a bizarre crop overnight. A yellow bulldozer idled near the tree line, its driver chatting with two men in hard hats. A white pickup truck with a Lakeside Villas Development logo sat parked right on my land. I approached the group, my voice calm but with an edge. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" One of the men, tall, young, and wearing a neon safety vest, glanced at a clipboard before answering. "We're just prepping for Phase 3 construction, breaking ground next week." I frowned. "Phase 3 of what Lakeside Villas expansion?" he said. Like I should have known. Luxury homes, HOA project. I told him this was my land, that I hadn't sold it to anyone. He looked confused, then pointed toward the road. "You might want to talk to your HOA president." She said it was all cleared. Oh, I wanted to talk to her. All right. That afternoon, I knocked on Karen's door. She opened it wearing a pastel sweater set, the kind that probably cost more than my entire month's groceries. Behind her, the foyer looked like a magazine spread vases of white lilies, polished floors you could see your reflection in. "Jack," she said, feigning surprise. "What brings you here?" I didn't bother with small talk. "Karen, there's construction equipment on my property. Survey stakes, too. You know anything about that?" Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, of course. We've been planning this expansion for months." The land was rezoned and purchased by the HOA for community development. It's going to be wonderful. More homes, more amenities, higher property values for everyone. I crossed my arms. "Karen, I never sold that land." Her tone shifted, becoming clipped. "Jack, you must be mistaken. It's all in the paperwork. We've got the approvals." "Then show me," I said. She hesitated for just a moment, long enough to register. "I'll have the documents sent over," she said finally. Then she shut the door with the kind of firmness that says the conversation is over. Only, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, I went through my own records, deeds, tax receipts, old surveys. Every scrap of paper said the same thing: the land was still mine. No transfers, no sales, no signatures from me. But there was something in Karen's voice that told me she truly believed she had the right to build. That, or she was putting on the performance of a lifetime. The next morning, I returned to the field. The crew had doubled in size. A backhoe was digging test pits, and a cement truck was parked nearby. Someone had even put up temporary fencing along part of the lot, as if to mark their territory. A laminated sign read, "Future site of Lakeside Villas, Phase 3. I tore the sign down. The foreman stormed over, his face red. "You can't do that," he barked. "I can do whatever I want on my land." I shot back. "Now get your equipment off it before I call the sheriff." He muttered something under his breath and walked off. But the equipment stayed. I did call the sheriff. When Deputy Hall arrived, he listened to both sides and shrugged. "Look, this is a civil matter. You'll need to take it up with the county or a lawyer. I can't just shut them down." That was the first time I felt the frustration settle in, the kind that sticks in your chest and makes your hands curl into fists. They were moving fast, too fast, and they knew it. Over the next week, things escalated. Concrete forms went in. Rebar sprouted from the ground like weeds. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air from dawn until dusk. Karen sent me an official letter from the HOA, stating that trespassing on active construction sites within HOA boundaries will result in fines. Boundaries. The word rolled around in my head like a loose marble. Whose boundaries neighbors started to notice? 2. Elaine came by with a pie and a furrowed brow. "Jack, what's going on back there? They say those homes are going to be exclusive properties for approved buyers only. Sounds like they're trying to wall off half the lake." I told her what I knew, which wasn't much, but her concern only confirmed what I was starting to suspect. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a land grab, and if Karen thought I was going to roll over and let it happen, she'd picked the wrong neighbor to mess with. By the end of that week, I'd made 2 decisions. First, I was going to the county office to see exactly what paperwork the HOA claimed to have. Second, I was going to keep my eyes and ears open, because if they were bold enough to build on land that wasn't theirs, there had to be more holes in their plan. They wanted a fight. Fine, I'd give them one. The county office visit didn't exactly calm my nerves. I walked in with my manila folder of land deeds, thinking the clerk would take one look and shut this whole thing down. Instead, the woman at the desk name tag reading Marlene gave me a polite smile that didn't match the words coming out of her mouth. "Well, Mr. Morrison, it seems the HOA filed a development application last year," she said, flipping through a stack of forms. "But, there's no recorded transfer of ownership here. That's unusual." "Unusual," I leaned in. "They've got bulldozers on my property." "Marlene," she sighed, "if there's no deed, they don't own it. But they may have gotten preliminary zoning approval based on, well, assumptions. Assumptions I could feel the heat rising in my neck. They assumed my land was theirs." She handed me a copy of the application. Sure enough, it listed the parcel number, my parcel number, but under owner. It said, Lakeside Villas, HOA. No signature from me. No bill of sale, just there. I left the office with a knot in my gut and a copy of the paperwork in my hand. On the drive home, I passed the construction site. The frames for the first 2 houses were already up. Workers in neon vests moved like ants across the skeletons of what would soon be full-blown homes. Karen stood in the distance, arms folded, watching the progress with a look of smug satisfaction. That weekend, things escalated in ways I didn't think possible. First came the path closure. I'd been walking a trail from my house down to the water for decades, a worn dirt track between the pines. One morning, I found a bright orange plastic fence stretched across it with a sign, "Construction area no entry. My land, my path, blocked." I tore the fence down. The next day, it was back, this time with metal stakes. A laminated HOA notice was zip-tied to it, claiming trespassers will be reported to local authorities. Then came the warning letters. Karen, in her infinite gall, sent me 3 in a week. The first accused me of loitering near the construction site. The second claimed I'd interfered with contracted workers. The third, my personal favorite, fined me $500 for unauthorized removal of safety barriers. I didn't pay a dime. By mid-month, the project was in full swing. Trucks rolled in at sunrise, engines growling like thunder, nail guns cracked in rapid bursts. The smell of fresh-cut lumber and asphalt filled the air. It was relentless. And it wasn't just the noise, it was the way they carried themselves, as if my land was nothing more than a blank canvas for their grand vision. Karen took every opportunity to rub it in. One afternoon, I caught her giving a tour to a group of well-dressed couples, pointing at the half-built houses and raving about private lake access and exclusive community benefits. She spotted me watching and waved not a friendly wave, but the kind that says, "You're powerless, and I know it." I started keeping a notebook. Dates, times, incidents. I took photos of every new fence post, every delivery truck, every pile of material stacked on my grass. Not because I thought it would stop them, not yet, but because I knew one day it might matter. The intimidation didn't stop there. One evening, I came home to find my driveway partially blocked by a delivery truck unloading pallets of shingles. The driver shrugged. Karen said this was the staging area. I made him move, but not before he left deep ruts in the gravel. Neighbors were starting to talk. 2. Elaine came by again, this time without pie. Jack, they're telling folks the HOA owns the south field now, that it's always been that way. People are starting to believe it. That hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just about the land anymore, it was about my name, my reputation. If Karen could convince enough people that the HOA's version of events was the truth, then maybe, in some twisted way, it would become the truth in their eyes. By the end of that month, the tension was thick enough to choke on. I avoided the construction site when I could, not because I was scared, but because I could feel my temper stretching thin. And Karen seemed to thrive on provocation. The final straw in that round came on a Friday morning. I was sipping coffee on the porch when a pickup pulled into my drive. 2 HOA board members stepped out, clipboards in hand. They handed me a letter stating that the HOA now considered the southern parcel part of the Lakeside Villas community and that all land use decisions would be managed accordingly. I read it twice, then looked up. You do realize you can't just declare ownership of someone's land, right? One of them, a short man with a bad comb-over, muttered something about community progress and legal avenues. Then they left, dust from their tires swirling in the morning light. I sat there for a long time after they left, the letter limp in my hand. They were moving faster than I'd anticipated, and every day they gained ground literally and figuratively. If I didn't figure out their weak spot soon, I'd be standing in the shadow of 40 homes that weren't supposed to exist. And something in my gut told me they were making a mistake, a big one. I've always believed that arrogance is louder than competence. People who know what they're doing keep their mouths shut and get to work. People who don't, they talk, and Karen was doing a lot of talking. The break came on a Wednesday night. I'd been sitting at the kitchen table, thumbing through the latest pile of HOA threats, when I remembered something my father used to say: if you want to know the truth about land, don't look at the fences, look at the maps. So, I fired up the old desktop in my office, the one with a clunky tower and a monitor that hums faintly when it's on. I went to the county's online property database. It wasn't flashy, just a search box and some drop-down menus. I typed in my parcel number from memory, the way some people remember their social security number. And there it was. Parcel ID still listed under Jack Morrison. Deed transfer none. Last recorded sale, my grandfather to my father. 1978. Taxes paid in full. The line on ownership was as clear as the lake on a windless day. But when I searched for Lakeside Villas HOA, things got interesting. They had multiple parcels, all adjacent to mine but not mine. Yet, somehow, their Phase 3 development plan map online showed the southern field highlighted in blue as if it were theirs. A map that, I realized, was likely the same one they were waving around to potential buyers. I dug deeper, pulling up building permits. The county had issued conditional permits, meaning they could start certain prep work while the final approval went through, but the approval required proof of ownership, which meant either someone had signed off without verifying it, or someone had been fed bad information. The next day, I drove down to the county recorder's office in person. Marlene wasn't on duty. Instead, an older gentleman named Frank was at the counter. Frank had that look of someone who'd been doing the job so long that nothing surprised him anymore. "Morning, Frank," I said, sliding the development application across the counter. "Can you tell me who signed off on this?" He squinted at the papers. "Looks like preliminary approval from the zoning board. Pending." Oh, he tapped the ownership section. "This here is a problem. You're still the legal owner." That's what I thought. Whoever filed this must have assumed a sale went through. It didn't. If this goes to court, they're going to have a real hard time explaining why they built without a deed. That was the moment I knew I had them. This wasn't just an annoyance anymore. It was a full-blown legal misstep. the kind that can turn a construction project into a demolition site overnight. I thanked Frank, made copies of everything, and drove straight home. That night, I spread it all out on my dining room table: deeds, tax records, permits, aerial photos of the land, screenshots of their marketing materials. It looked like one of those crime scene boards you see on TV, minus the red string. The more I studied it, the more I realized their problem went beyond my land. Several of the lots they were marketing had easements running through them, rights of way for utilities and lake access that they hadn't accounted for. If someone like me wanted to get really nasty, they could make those easements public knowledge and watch the property values plummet before a single home sold. I decided to start small. First, I called a property attorney named David Walsh. I'd met him years ago when he helped a friend settle a boundary dispute. David had the kind of voice that sounded like it had seen 100 courtroom wins and didn't need to brag about any of them. "Jack," he said after I explained the situation, "you've got them in a corner. They can't claim adverse possession, not on a project this new. And if they started building without title, that's on them. We can file for an injunction to stop construction immediately." Music to my ears. Next, I bought a decent camera, not just my phone, but a real DSLR with a zoom lens. Every day, I documented progress on the site trucks crossing my boundary line, piles of materials stacked on my grass, workers digging trenches for utilities. I even caught Karen one afternoon, standing on what I knew was my land, pointing at the ground while barking orders. In between, I chatted with a few of the construction workers during their breaks. Most of them didn't care about HOA politics. They were just there to do a job. But one young guy, maybe mid-20s, let something slip. "They're rushing like crazy," he said, sipping a soda. "Boss says the sooner we get the houses framed, the harder it'll be for anyone to shut us down. HOA's banking on momentum." That told me two things. One, Karen was worried. And two, she thought speed would protect her. She was wrong. By the end of that week, I had a file thick enough to choke a paper shredder. And I wasn't just collecting for myself anymore. I was preparing to show it to anyone who could hurt her the way she'd been trying to hurt me. The funny thing is, once you see the weak point in someone's armor, you start noticing all the cracks. Karen was so busy playing queen of the subdivision that she hadn't noticed her kingdom was built on sand, and I was about to pull the tide in. If there's one thing about people like Karen, it's that they can smell resistance. I hadn't filed anything in court yet, but she must have felt the shift the way I stopped avoiding the construction site and started showing up with a camera, the way I didn't flinch when her HOA letters landed in my mailbox. And like any good bully sensing a threat, she came swinging. The first salvo came in the form of a fine, not a polite little slap-on-the-wrist fine, either an $800 violation fee for unauthorized entry into HOA-controlled property. She'd even stapled a grainy zoomed-in photo of me standing in my own field as evidence. I tacked it to my fridge like a child's art project. The second came 2 days later, a formal notice declaring that, due to multiple infractions, I was banned from attending HOA meetings until I had resolved outstanding compliance issues. This would have been funny if it wasn't so brazen I wasn't even part of the HOA. But Karen wasn't just working on paper. That Friday, I came home from a supply run to find a new, taller temporary fence cutting off nearly 20 feet of my property. It was reinforced with metal panels, the kind you see at big commercial sites, and blocked my usual route down to the lake. There was a laminated sign zip-tied to the middle, "Active construction, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." I stood there a long time, hands on my hips, before walking back to the house. Cutting it down would have been satisfying, but I knew she was baiting me, probably hoping for something she could spin into criminal destruction of HOA property. Later that evening, I noticed something else. On my usual trip to the local diner, I got a few strange looks from folks I'd known for years. Two people I waved at didn't wave back. When I sat at the counter, old Jim, who's run the place since the 80s, leaned in and said quietly, "Jack, you know they're saying you've been harassing workers and threatening people, right?" I felt my jaw tighten. "Who's they?" He gave me a look that said we both knew the answer. Rumors are like spilled oil once they hit the water. You can't clean them all up. And Karen was dumping barrels. By Monday, I'd heard from Elaine that the HOA newsletter had published a community alert about ongoing harassment of authorized contractors and false claims about property boundaries by individuals uninformed of zoning changes. I didn't even get the courtesy of being named, just individuals. The harassment didn't stop there. One morning, as I stood at the edge of the field taking photos, a group of workers repositioned one of the portable toilets so it faced directly toward my porch. The next day, a dump truck accidentally left a pile of gravel blocking part of my driveway. Even my mail started arriving late, and sometimes not at all. I couldn't prove it was HOA related, but the timing was suspicious. I called David, my attorney, and told him what was happening. He chuckled darkly. "They're trying to rattle you. Don't take the bait. The more they escalate without legal grounds, the better they look in front of a judge." Still, it was hard not to take it personally. This was my home, the one place in the world I was supposed to feel untouchable, and Karen was turning it into a siege zone. The boldest move came midweek. I was walking the boundary line when two uniformed security guards, yes, security guards, stopped me. They wore matching black polos with Lakeside Security embroidered on the chest, and their tone was all business. "Sir, this is an active HOA property. We're going to need you to vacate." I raised an eyebrow. "You're standing on my land telling me to leave my land, sir. We're not here to debate." I didn't argue further. Instead, I took out my phone, hit record, and asked them to repeat what they'd just said. They didn't like that. One walked off muttering into a radio. The other stood silent until I left on my own terms. That night, I uploaded the clip to a private folder I'd started keeping a digital vault of every hostile act, every bogus notice, every fence and fine and rumor. My case file was becoming a weapon. Karen's mistake was thinking this was a battle of intimidation. She didn't understand that I'd spent my career in civil engineering, which meant I'd sat through more zoning meetings, land surveys, and property disputes than she could imagine. I knew her game, and I knew that sooner or later, paper and facts beat bluster and rumor. The pressure she was applying told me something important. She knew there was a crack in her foundation. And the more she tried to bury me under fines, fences, and fake news, the bigger that crack was going to get. By the end of that week, I'd stopped thinking of this as defense. I was done playing goalie. It was time to move the ball downfield, and I had just the play in mind. By now, my dining room table looked less like a place to eat and more like a war room. Every inch was covered deed copies in neat stacks. Printed screenshots of the county's property database, photos with date stamps, HOA notices, and my own notes scribbled in thick black ink. Each pile was a piece of the same puzzle, and I could see the image forming clearer every day. Karen had built her empire on a lie, and I had the proof to burn it down. David, my attorney, came by one afternoon to go over the plan. He was the kind of man who never wasted words. He studied the documents in silence for a long while, then looked up with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "They've overreached so badly," he said, "that the only question is how much damage we want to do. We can file for an injunction tomorrow, stop all construction cold. But if we're smart, we let them hang themselves a little longer. The more they build, the more leverage you have." I understood immediately. If Karen thought she was sprinting toward victory, she was actually running full speed into a brick wall. And I was happy to let her keep running. Step one was tightening my own case. I went to the county clerk and got notarized affidavits confirming I was the sole owner of the parcel. I met with a retired surveyor, an old family friend, who dug out original plat maps from decades ago and marked every inch of my property lines in ink so clear a child could follow it. Step two was finding allies. Elaine was the first to sign a statement about the construction blocking public lake access, something the HOA was legally obligated to preserve. Then there was Pete, the guy who ran the bait shop in town, who told me he'd overheard a contractor griping about being told to just ignore the property line and get the concrete down. Step three was my favorite, turning the spotlight on Karen. I called up a local news reporter I knew from years back. A sharp woman named Lisa who had a nose for the kind of small-town corruption that could go viral online. I gave her a teaser. How would you like to cover a story about 40 brand new homes being built on land the builder doesn't own? She didn't need to be asked twice. By the end of that week, I had Lisa quietly working her sources, confirming permits, and talking to neighbors. The HOA didn't know it yet, but the fuse was lit. Meanwhile, I decided to hit Karen where it would hurt most in her sales pitch, using the contact info from the glossy HOA flyers. I called a few of the interested buyers, posing as a curious neighbor. I didn't tell them not to buy. I simply asked if their realtor had mentioned the pending property dispute. The silence on the other end of the line told me all I needed to know. Then, in a move that felt almost too satisfying, I sent a certified letter to the HOA board, every member, not just Karen, informing them of my legal claim and warning that any purchase agreements signed for Phase 3 lots could be voided in court. I knew at least a few of them would start sweating. After all, HOA loyalty only goes so far when personal liability enters the equation. Karen's response was to double down. The construction pace actually increased. More crews, more materials, more noise. It was clear she was trying to cross some invisible finish line before I could drag her into court. But what she didn't realize was that every nail, every board, every drop of poured concrete was adding to my eventual payout or giving me more leverage to force a teardown. One morning, while I was photographing a new retaining wall they'd installed, a foreman walked over and said quietly, "You didn't hear it from me, but the HOA's running low on funds. They need the first home sales to go through just to cover the last phase of construction." That was gold. If they were cash-strapped, they'd be even more vulnerable when the sales stalled. And I was about to stall them hard. By the second week of my plan, I'd met with David again. "We file the injunction next Monday," he said. "Lisa's story drops the same day. You'll have the legal and public opinion sides hitting them at once. By the end of that week, you'll either have an offer for the land at triple market value, state law allows it in cases like this, or they'll be begging to negotiate." I nodded, feeling that calm that comes when a fight shifts from defense to offense. This wasn't just about protecting my property anymore. It was about making a statement that you don't get to trample people and expect them to bow. That night, I stood at the edge of the field, watching the sunset pour gold over the half-built homes. In the distance, Karen was giving another tour to a couple in matching windbreakers. She gestured at the houses, probably talking about exclusive views and tight-knit community values. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because in less than a week, she'd find herself standing in this same spot, but the ground beneath her would feel very, very different. The Monday we'd marked on the calendar started like any other spring morning, except I woke up knowing by sundown the board Karen had been standing on for months was going to collapse. David met me at the courthouse just after 8. He was wearing his trial suit, charcoal gray with a crisp white shirt, and carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen 100 other victories. We filed the injunction first thing, a clean, airtight request to halt all construction and sales on my parcel, backed by every deed, tax receipt, and sworn statement I'd collected. The clerk stamped it, and just like that, the legal machinery started grinding. An hour later, Lisa's article went live. The headline was impossible to ignore. HOA builds 40 homes on land. They don't own legal battle looms. She'd included aerial shots of the development, side by side with property maps proving my ownership. She quoted the county clerk, the surveyor, Elaine, and even a former HOA board member who admitted they'd assumed the land was purchased. By noon, the article was being shared all over town, and a few bigger real estate blogs had already picked it up. That night's HOA meeting was standing room only. I walked into a room humming with tension, folding chairs crammed into the community hall, people standing along the walls, a local news crew setting up lights in the back. Karen sat at the head table in a powder blue blazer, looking like she'd been rehearsing her everything's fine face in the mirror all day. When my turn came to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, setting a thick folder on the table in front of me. "What you're looking at behind your houses, what some of you have been told is HOA property, is mine. I own it. I've always owned it. And here's the proof." I pulled out the certified deeds, holding them high enough for the cameras. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. I could see people craning their necks to read the seals and signatures. "This," I said, tapping the papers, is the original and only legal record of ownership for Parcel 17B. No deed transfer, no sale, no lease. Which means every foundation poured, every nail driven, every dollar spent back there has been on land that does not belong to the HOA. Karen tried to cut in, waving her hand like she was swatting a fly. Jack, this is a misunderstanding. The paperwork. The paperwork, I said, turning to her, is why we're here. Your permits were conditional. Your application listed my property under your name without my consent or any legal transaction. That's fraud, Karen, and as of this morning, there's a court injunction halting all work and all sales until this is resolved. The room erupted, some in outrage, some in whispered disbelief. The HOA's attorney, who'd been sitting stiffly beside Karen, leaned in and whispered something in her ear. Her face went pale. I wasn't done. I've also made sure that every potential buyer is aware of this dispute. I said, because I think it's only fair that folks know before they hand over hundreds of thousands of dollars for a house that might be sitting on someone else's land. A man in the third row stood up. My wife and I put down a deposit last week. Are you saying I'm saying, I cut in, that if this goes to trial, I'll either be compensated at triple market value under state law or those houses come down? And that's not a threat. It's the law. The board erupted into a flurry of whispers, papers shuffling, eyes darting toward Karen. I could feel the tide turning right there in that hall. The meeting ended in chaos. Some folks stormed out. Others cornered Karen with rapid-fire questions. The news crew caught every second, their cameras following her as she tried to make a hasty exit. I stayed until the last of the crowd thinned, chatting with a few neighbors who looked half shocked, half impressed. 2 days later, the HOA's lawyer called David. The message was simple. They wanted to talk settlement. The numbers they floated were insulting at first, barely above market value. David countered with triple, citing the statute, plus coverage for legal fees. By Friday, they'd caved. The HOA didn't have the cash, so the deal we struck was almost poetic. I would take possession of the homes already built at a token price, sell or rent them myself, and they would transfer the remainder of their development parcels to me to settle the debt. In one swoop, their expansion dreams were dead, and I was the largest landowner in Lakeside. The following week, I walked the length of the southern field, now dotted with 40 half-finished houses that were, for the first time, indisputably mine. The crews were gone. The site was silent except for the wind moving through the unfinished rafters. Standing there, I thought about how quickly power shifts when the truth steps into the light, and how Karen had walked herself into this trap one overconfident stride at a time. From that day forward, every time I saw her name, it was on the HOA's past president list. She'd resigned, of course, moved 2 towns over, if the rumors were right, but I didn't care where she went. What mattered was that here, in Lakeside, the ground she once strutted on now belonged to me. In the weeks that followed the settlement, the air around the lake seemed to change. The sound of hammers and saws had been replaced by birdsong and the gentle slap of water against the shore. The construction crews were long gone, the temporary fences dismantled. For the first time in months, I could walk my southern field without seeing an orange safety vest or hearing someone bark orders over a power tool. The houses stood there like silent witnesses, 40 reminders of arrogance built on a faulty foundation. I took ownership of them officially the day the ink dried on the transfer paperwork. The HOA's lawyer handed over the keys in a manila envelope. Looking like he'd aged 10 years since our first meeting, David and I walked the property together that afternoon. We stepped through each home, one by one, checking the work. Some were nearly finished granite countertops gleaming in the kitchens, hardwood floors already laid, bathroom tiles grouted. Others were nothing more than framed shells with exposed beams and dusty plywood floors. I made notes in a spiral-bound notebook, already thinking about which ones to complete first for rental and which to sell outright. Within a month, I had a plan in motion. A few local contractors, the kind who knew the value of handshake deals and quiet work, came on board to finish the homes at a reasonable pace. I made sure every worker knew the truth about how the land had come back into my hands, not out of vanity, but because I wanted the story told right. Word traveled fast. In a small town, it always does. People who'd once believed Karen's narrative were now stopping me in the diner to shake my hand. Elaine brought over another pie, this time with a note taped to the lid that read, "To the man who stood his ground." Pete from the bait shop started sending prospective renters my way, knowing a lakefront address here was worth its weight in gold. Financially, the whole ordeal turned into something I could never have planned for. Between the sales of a few homes and rental income from others, I was set for life. But money was never the point. The real win was standing on that land, knowing I hadn't let someone bulldoze over my rights. Karen, on the other hand, all but vanished from the picture. Rumor had it she tried to keep her HOA presidency after the loss, but the board voted her out in record time. Too many lawsuits, too much bad press. The last I heard, she'd sold her home in Lakeside and moved to a gated community in another county, presumably one where she could play queen again without someone like me in her way. What stuck with me most wasn't just the victory, but the lesson in how fragile the truth can be if you don't stand up for it. If I'd ignored those first survey stakes, if I'd assumed the system would work itself out, Karen would be sipping champagne on the deck of a home built on land that used to be mine, and I'd be staring at a legal nightmare with no leverage left. The other lesson was more personal when you push back with facts and patience. You strip a bully of their favorite weapon, intimidation. Karen tried everything to make me fold. Fines, rumors, fences, even hired guards. But at the end of the day, she couldn't change the one thing that mattered, the truth printed in black ink on a decades-old deed. Now, on quiet evenings, I walked the stretch of shoreline behind those houses, sometimes stopping to fish or just watch the sunset. The homes are rented to families who appreciate the lake for what it is, not as a trophy, but as a place to belong. Kids play on the docks, neighbors wave as I pass, and the air feels lighter without Karen's shadow hanging over it. I keep one of the laminated no trespassing HOA property signs in my shed, not as a warning, but as a reminder. Every time I see it, I remember the day she told me I was standing on her land, when in fact, she was standing on mine. And I remember how good it felt to prove her wrong in front of a whole town. Life has a way of testing how much we're willing to stand up for ourselves. Sometimes the fight isn't about winning something new, but keeping what was yours all along. This battle wasn't just about land or houses, it was about refusing to let arrogance rewrite the truth. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's that your rights are only as strong as your willingness to defend them. Whether it's your property, your reputation, or your peace of mind. Don't hand it over just because someone acts like they have the power. Power isn't in how loud someone talks or how fast they move. It's in the facts, the patience, and the quiet persistence to see it through. So, tell me, have you ever had to stand your ground against someone who thought they could push you out of your own place? Share your story in the comments. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of folks who know that sometimes the best revenge is simply not losing.